Have you ever had someone beside you every single day, quiet, loyal, always there until one day? They weren't. He was a CEO, 45 years old, a man with power, respect, and a corner office high above the Boston skyline. She was his secretary, steady, precise, invisible to most, but not to him. Not really, for 11 years. She never missed a day, never asked for credit. She knew what he needed before he did. But one morning, her desk was empty. No goodbye, no warning. Just gone. What do you do when the person who kept your world turning walks away? Would you chase them, apologize? Or would you only realize what you lost too late? This is not a story about romance. It's about presence, absence, and the quiet damage of being taken for granted. If you've ever stayed too long where you were unseen, or walked away hoping someone would finally notice, this story might just be yours. Like, share, and subscribe to Shining Stories so you don't miss the rest of this quietly powerful journey. Let's begin. Mark Hensley always arrived at the office at exactly 7:15 a.m., not a minute early, never late. He walked through the quiet corridors of Hensley & Co., a mid-sized financial tech firm headquartered in downtown Boston, with the same quiet confidence he brought to every negotiation, every boardroom, every decision. He didn't talk much in the elevator. He nodded at security with a polite, unreadable smile. His dark navy suits fit like armor, pressed with precision. His leather briefcase always in his left hand. Watch always set 5 minutes ahead, a trick he used to stay on top of his own time. People said he was brilliant, focused, the kind of leader who never cracked under pressure. But no one called him warm, and Mark preferred it that way. To Mark, success wasn't about likability. It was about control, predictability, power. He had built the company from scratch at 32, signing his first Series A deal out of a cramped studio apartment with a whiteboard, 2 interns, and an overworked French press. 13 years later, Hensley & Co. was valued at just under $200 million and held contracts with 3 national banks. And Mark, he had the view from the 31st floor, a corner office lined with floor-to-ceiling glass. He had the gym membership he never used, the Tesla he rarely drove, the watch collection he wore only one at a time. By all accounts, he had won. But somewhere in the perfectly curated silence of his routine, something had gone unnoticed. Or rather, someone. Claire Whitmore. She had worked for him for 11 years. Same desk, same poise, same steady presence. No drama, no delays, no unmet expectations. Every meeting on his calendar was arranged by her. Every flight booked. Every detail cross-checked. Every crisis softened before it ever reached his inbox. She was the hum in the background of a perfectly tuned machine. The rhythm he never questioned. The stillness behind power. Mark never asked where she lived. Never asked if she liked her job. She didn't talk about her personal life, and he never invited her to. There was an understanding between them, built not with words, but with time, with routine. Every morning when he walked into his office, the lights were already on. His coffee dark roast. No sugar was placed to the left of his monitor, just the way he liked it. The blinds drawn halfway to let in just enough morning light. Claire never made small talk. She never needed to. Her efficiency was her language. And Mark, for years, had believed that was enough. It was Evelyn Grant, the firm's HR manager, who once said, "Claire is the kind of person you only notice when she's gone." Mark had chuckled. Then it's a good thing she's never gone. But Evelyn had only smiled, as if she knew something he didn't. On Monday mornings, Claire wore navy or gray. On Thursdays, she added a small note to his briefing folder, sometimes a quote, sometimes a quick insight on a competitor's movement. Nothing excessive, always sharp, always useful. He never commented on them, but he read every one. There was one Thursday in late March when the quote read, "There is no strength in silence, only in understanding what it protects." Mark had paused at that, then folded the note and tucked it into the inner pocket of his blazer. He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't ask anything. Their rhythm was precise, predictable, quiet, and yet, sometimes in those late evenings when only a few lights remained on in the office and the city outside stretched into golden stillness, Mark found himself glancing toward her desk. Claire worked with headphones on, usually with a cup of herbal tea, and her posture straight, dignified. She never slouched, never fidgeted. She moved like a person who had long mastered the art of not taking up too much space. But one night, around 8:40 p.m., Mark noticed something. Claire was laughing, not loudly. Just a soft chuckle into her phone as she leaned back slightly in her chair. Mark wasn't eavesdropping, at least not intentionally, but the sound caught him off guard. She looked different when she laughed, more open, more human. And for a moment, he felt something unfamiliar. Not jealousy, not curiosity. It was more like interruption. As if her world extended beyond the one he knew, and he hadn't even thought to ask what was there. That night, as he left the building alone, Mark walked slower than usual. The halls echoed. The city lights flickered against the glass. And for the first time in years, he wondered what Claire did when she left the office, who she became once she took off the headset and shut down the screens, and why he'd never thought to find out before. Claire Whitmore never liked being the center of attention. Not at work, not at dinner parties, not even in photographs. She moved through life with the quiet grace of someone who had long accepted that being essential didn't require being visible. At Hensley & Co., she wasn't listed on the website's leadership page. Her title, executive secretary, sounded modest, but everyone in the building knew the truth. Without Claire, the day didn't run. Not really. Her office sat just outside Mark Hensley's. A glass wall divided their spaces. But it was Claire who managed the flow of everything, coming in and out meetings, vendors, interview schedules, internal requests, calendar changes, client prep packets. She didn't make noise. She made things happen. It was Claire who remembered when the quarterly board report was due before the CFO did. Claire who noticed when a key client seemed quiet in emails and suggested a lunch meeting. Claire who placed a spare umbrella in the office closet before the rainstorm hit on Tuesday morning. These were not the things listed on her job description. They were the things no one taught, the kind that required watching people closely and caring more than you were expected to. Claire arrived at 7:05 a.m. every morning, 5 minutes before Mark. She liked having those moments to herself, the hum of fluorescent lights, the click of her low heels across the tile, the faint whir of printers waking up. She'd make a cup of tea, check his calendar, and adjust the day with surgical precision. Her desk was always immaculate. A small wooden box held spare paper clips. A muted green notebook rested at a perfect angle beside her keyboard. No trinkets, just a single framed photo turned slightly inward. A woman in her 60s and a teenage boy. Her mother, her younger brother. Mark had never asked. Claire had never offered. Most of their exchanges were under 10 words. Rescheduled to 3:00. Client confirmed. PDF in your inbox. And once after she handed him a revised investor pitch with all the numbers recalculated, he looked at her and simply said, "Thanks." It was the only time he'd said that in 3 years. She didn't smile, but she remembered. There was a rhythm to their silence, like a melody that only needed two instruments, one strong, one steady. Mark led, Claire followed, but over time, she'd learned to anticipate his direction before he even moved. She knew when he needed a second coffee, but wouldn't ask. She knew when a long pause meant he was overwhelmed, not indifferent. She knew when not to interrupt, and when he needed interrupting. And yet, for all that knowing, there was one thing Claire had no answer for. Why it still hurt to be so important to someone who never really saw her. Evelyn Grant had noticed it too, during a compliance audit last year. Evelyn had stopped by Claire's desk and said softly, "You know, some people think you're the reason this place still breathes." Claire had smiled politely, but her eyes didn't move from the screen. "It's just a job," she replied. But Evelyn had shaken her head. "No, it's not. Not when you give it this much of yourself." There were days Claire went home and barely remembered the sound of her own voice. The office was so full of purpose, of deadlines and projections and client calls, that sometimes it was easy to forget that all of it, everything was being held together by a quiet woman at a desk no one looked at twice. Well, not no one. There were others, mostly clients, visiting partners, a few board members who did look like Daniel Cross, a venture partner from a New York firm who had taken to complimenting her taste in scarves, or asking about the tea she always brought to meetings. Harmless comments, but warm in a way that caught Claire off guard. One afternoon, as Mark was preparing for a panel discussion, Daniel leaned toward her in the hallway and said, "You're the only reason this place runs on time, aren't you?" She had laughed quietly. Mark heard the sound from his office. He didn't say anything, didn't even glance up when she came in a minute later with his folder. But something inside him tightened. That night, as he reviewed the panel talking points Claire had annotated with delicate pencil notes, he paused at one margin where she had written, "Emphasize empathy investors respond to leaders who listen." He underlined it once, then closed the file. Mark didn't know why it bothered him seeing her smile at someone else, hearing her laugh. But he did know this. For the first time in a long while, Claire felt distant, not professionally, emotionally, like the rhythm had shifted. And he didn't know how, or if he could fix it. It started with small things. A brief pause before Claire entered Mark's office. A longer delay in replying to internal messages. A silence that wasn't professional. It was careful. Like a space she was suddenly protecting. Mark Hensley noticed, not in an obvious way. He didn't watch her. He wasn't the type. But he noticed the way a room feels colder after the heater shuts off. You don't hear the click, but you feel the air change. Claire had always been composed, respectful, predictable. But now, something was held back, and Mark didn't know how to ask why. It wasn't jealousy. That's what he told himself. Not when Daniel Cross arrived again. The venture partner from New York was charming, loud in a sophisticated kind of way. His tailored suits always had a pocket square. His compliments were well-timed and just subtle enough to feel sincere. During a quarterly review meeting, Mark watched Daniel enter the conference room and offer Claire a warm nod. Claire. Daniel smiled. Still holding this place together? She smiled back. Someone has to. The room chuckled. Mark didn't. Later that afternoon, Mark reviewed the post-meeting brief Claire had prepared. Flawless, as always. She had included a handwritten sticky note. Cross asked if you'd follow up next week. He's open Tuesday morning. Mark crumpled the note after reading it. He didn't know why. But it stayed in his fist a few seconds longer than it needed to. That evening, the building was quiet again, just like always. Mark stood by the window in his office, staring at the streetlights flickering across Beacon Street. People below moved, with purpose, holding grocery bags, guiding dogs on leashes, waving from car windows. It was life. Warm, imperfect, messy. He hadn't touched any of that in years. Behind him, he heard Claire's voice. She was on a call, her tone calm, but a little softer than usual. I know. I'll be there? Yes. No. I don't mind. It's okay. Really. He doesn't ask much. Mark blinked. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but something in his chest tightened. He didn't ask about the call the next morning. He told himself it wasn't his place. But then she came in later than usual. 7:13 instead of 7:05. A few strands of her hair were still damp, and she wore a dark emerald blouse he'd never seen before. And Mark did something he rarely did. He looked at her a moment longer than necessary. New? He asked quietly, nodding toward her outfit. Claire glanced down, a little surprised. Yes? First time wearing it? It suits you. She gave a small smile. Thank you. It was only 2 words. But for Mark, it lingered all morning. At lunch, Daniel Cross sent flowers to the office. Not for Mark. Not for the company. For Claire. The card read, for your time and grace. It's rare these days. Tulips, yellow and white, arranged in a minimalist glass vase. Claire's cheeks flushed when she saw them, but she said nothing. Evelyn Grant passed by her desk later and whispered, Well, that's new. Claire had smiled, but her eyes were distant. Mark had watched the whole thing unfold from behind the glass wall of his office. And for the first time in years, he didn't open his email. He just sat there, watching. He was angry. Not at Claire, not at Daniel. At the silence between them. The years of not asking, not noticing, not being someone she could confide in. What if she left? Would he even know why? Would she even feel she owed him an explanation? That night, Mark found himself staring at the old holiday card pinned to his corkboard. A simple design snowflakes and the words, "Thank you," in silver foil. It had come from Claire, 2 years ago. She had signed only her name. He had never replied. He'd never even mentioned it. A few days later, Mark stepped into the elevator alone. As the doors began to close, he heard Claire call, "Hold the door." He did. She stepped in, slightly out of breath, holding a slim file folder in her phone. The elevator hummed to life. Silence settled. Mark glanced sideways. She smelled faintly of jasmine Or maybe citrus. He wasn't sure. He'd never tried to guess before. Daniel Cross, Mark said suddenly. Seems fond of you. Claire looked over, a little caught off guard. Then she nodded, without smiling. He's kind, she said. Mark hesitated. Do you see him? The doors opened. Claire stepped out before answering. But just before she turned down the hallway, she said quietly over her shoulder, I don't think you ever asked that before. And then she walked away. The next morning, the flowers were gone from her desk. The vase sat empty in the staff kitchen. There was an email Mark never sent. He had typed it around 11:00 p.m. On a Thursday night, Claire, thank you for everything you do. I see it, even if I haven't said it. He stared at the blinking cursor, then hit delete. That Friday, during a strategy session, Mark struggled to focus. Claire had prepared everything as usual, but she didn't sit in. She always did. This time, she had left the folder on his desk, gave a short nod, and walked out. Daniel Cross noticed. After the meeting, he asked casually, something going on with her? Mark shook his head. Not that I'm aware of. Daniel studied him a second longer than necessary. If you're not, someone else will. Then he left. And Mark realized he hadn't lost her. Not yet. But he was running out of time. The elevator doors slid open at 7:15 a.m., as always. Mark Hensley stepped into the executive suite with the same posture he carried into every negotiation, calm, upright, unreadable. His suit was charcoal gray, the cuffs of his shirt pressed just right, his tie, navy with a subtle pinstripe. The office smelled of warm coffee and recycled air. But Claire's desk was empty. No teacup, no rustle of pages, no quiet tap of keys, just stillness. The kind that didn't settle, the kind that lingered. She arrived 2 minutes later, unusual for her, but not late. Mark didn't say anything, only glanced toward her as she removed her coat and settled in without looking his way. She wore her hair down, a small detail, but he noticed. It framed her face differently, softer, less office, more human. That morning, their exchange was mechanical. Presentation ready, she said, passing the folder across his desk. He nodded. Thank you. That was all. But the way she turned quick, careful, told him something had shifted. Throughout the week, the shift grew wider. Claire began forwarding emails instead of walking in. She left for lunch. She never used to. Her voice lost its lilt, its natural rhythm. She answered every question, fulfilled every task, but not once did she linger. Not once did she look him in the eye unless she had to. Mark had spent his entire life building distance between himself and failure, between himself and chaos, between himself and anything unpredictable. But this distance felt personal, and he didn't know how to close it. One afternoon, Mark overheard Evelyn Grant at the coffee station saying to someone from HR, Claire's been quieter than usual, even for her. The other person laughed. How do you get quieter than Claire? Evelyn replied. When someone starts pulling back, it's not always about volume. Sometimes it's about space. Mark stopped walking. He wanted to ask what she meant, but he already knew. That evening, Claire worked late. She sat in the conference room with her laptop open, organizing feedback from a major client call. Mark had stayed, too on purpose. though he pretended it was because of deadlines. He watched her from the hallway. She looked tired, her blouse slightly creased, her eyes focused, but dimmer than usual. He knocked on the doorframe softly. She looked up, neutral. "You didn't have to stay late," he said. "I know," she replied, then looked back at her screen. A beat of silence passed. Then Mark asked, more hesitantly than he meant to, "Are you all right?" Claire paused. Then, gently, "Of course, everything's fine." She smiled, but not like before. It didn't reach her eyes, and Mark didn't press. That night, he sat at home with a glass of bourbon and stared out the window. The city lights flickered. Somewhere below, life moved on, people laughing in restaurants, dog walkers bundled in coats, delivery drivers unloading boxes under the buzz of neon. He lived 37 floors above it all. That used to feel like peace. Tonight, it felt like exile. He remembered the first year Claire joined Hensley & Co. She had been sharp from day one, not in a flashy way, but in how she listened, how she anticipated, how she handled pressure without folding. Back then, she used to leave handwritten notes on his desk, small reminders, occasional encouragements. She had stopped a few years ago, and he had never asked why. The next morning, she brought in coffee, his usual, but she didn't wait for him to taste it like she used to. She simply set it down and walked out. Mark took a sip. It was bitter. Not the coffee, the silence. Later that week, Daniel Cross called for a follow-up. Mark almost didn't take it. But Claire had already set it on his calendar, already printed the prep notes, already highlighted the key points. At the end of the call, Daniel chuckled and said, "You've got a gem there with Claire." "Anyone ever tell you that Mark's throat tightened?" "She's efficient," he said flatly. Daniel paused, then said, not unkindly, "That's a cold word for someone that loyal." The line went silent, and Mark was left with the ringing. Friday evening. Claire gathered her things earlier than usual. She paused at her desk, staring at something on her screen. Mark stood at his door, unsure why he hadn't left yet. Heading out, he asked. She turned, nodding. "My mom's in town," she said. "Thought I'd take her out." He nodded. "That's nice." Claire smiled. "Just a little. Good night. Mr. Hensley?" "Claire," he started. She stopped, but he didn't finish, and she didn't wait. The elevator doors closed behind her, and Mark stood in the silence again. Only this time, he couldn't pretend he didn't feel it. The office buzzed with an energy it hadn't seen in years. It was the 10th anniversary of Hensley & Co., a celebration Mark had insisted be professional, not extravagant. No champagne towers, no dance floors, just soft jazz, tasteful canapes, and polished smiles. Still, the company had rented a rooftop venue at a boutique hotel near the harbor. The Boston skyline flickered with early evening lights as employees gathered in coats and evening dresses, trading small talk and laughter beneath string lights and propane heaters. Mark stood near the railing, one hand in his pocket, the other loosely holding a glass of water. He didn't drink much at work events. He preferred control, observation. And tonight, he observed everything, especially her, Claire. She arrived 30 minutes after the event started. And for a moment, just a moment, the rooftop quieted. She wore a dark blue dress, long-sleeved, with a subtle shimmer in the light. elegant, understated. She had pulled her hair back, revealing more of her face than usual. Simple earrings, no necklace. She looked different, familiar, but distant, like someone who had once lived in your house and redecorated after you left. Mark didn't approach her at first. He watched from a polite distance as she spoke to Evelyn Grant, accepted a glass of wine, and smiled at someone from accounting. There was a softness to her tonight, a calm detachment that made her seem out of reach. Daniel Cross arrived shortly after, in a gray overcoat and a quiet grin. He spotted Claire almost immediately and walked over without hesitation. They exchanged a warm greeting. He leaned in slightly as he spoke, hands in his pockets, body language easy. Mark's grip on his glass tightened. They laughed at something. Claire touched Daniel's arm lightly in passing. It wasn't flirtatious. It was effortless. And that's what bothered Mark the most. He tried to focus on conversations thanking department heads, chatting with investors, checking on the event coordinator. But he kept catching glimpses of Claire, dancing in and out of circles, always graceful, always composed. But not once did she come to him. She had always been his shadow in events like this. Quietly behind him, handing him note cards, reminding him of names. Tonight, she wasn't near him at all, and she looked freer for it. Later, as the night thinned and guests began gathering their coats, Mark found himself standing by the dessert table, pretending to decide between lemon tart and chocolate mousse. Claire stepped up beside him. "I didn't think you'd come," he said quietly. She didn't look at him. "I almost didn't." There was a pause. "You look." Mark started, then stopped. Claire glanced sideways. "Different." He shook his head. "Like yourself." She smiled, but it was bittersweet. "I haven't been that for a while," she said. Just then, Daniel approached with 2 glasses of wine. "Claire," he said, handing one to her, "I hope you'll consider what we talked about earlier." Mark turned slightly. "What's that?" Daniel smiled, completely at ease. "We're expanding our East Coast offices. I mentioned to Claire she'd make a brilliant operations lead." Mark stared at him. "I didn't realize she was on the market." Daniel raised an eyebrow, then looked at Claire. "That's up to her." "Of course." Claire took the wine. "I told him I'd think about it." Mark said nothing, but his jaw clenched. When Daniel walked away, Mark remained frozen. Claire took a sip from her glass and looked out toward the harbor. "Would you take it?" he asked finally. She didn't turn to him. "Would you care if I did?" Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. Claire set her glass down on the table. "I'm heading out," she said. "It's been a long day." She turned to leave. "Claire," she stopped. "I never meant to make you feel unappreciated." Her eyes met his. "It's not what you meant that mattered, Mark." And with that, she walked away, heels clicking against the rooftop floor until the elevator doors opened and closed behind her. That night, Mark didn't go home right away. He returned to the office, alone, lights low. Silence stretching through the rooms like fog. He sat at his desk, turned off his phone, and just sat for minutes, maybe hours. And in the quiet, he realized something terrifying. She was already halfway gone, and he didn't know how to bring her back. The next morning, Claire didn't come in, nor the next, on the 3rd day. Mark finally asked Evelyn if she'd heard anything. Evelyn hesitated, then said gently she filed her resignation, effective immediately. Mark's stomach dropped. There was no conversation. He said, "No, just a letter and a box." She handed him a small cardboard box light, no more than a few pounds. Inside was Claire's headset, a stack of old notebooks, a framed picture of her mother and brother, and one envelope, no name on it. Just a single sentence written on the flap. "There's nothing louder than being ignored." Mark opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a folded note. "For years, I translated your silence into meaning. I told myself loyalty was enough. That being needed meant being seen. But I was wrong. I stayed because I believed. I left because I couldn't keep pretending not to notice that you never once asked me to stay." He sat with that note in his hands long after the sun had risen over the Boston skyline. Claire was gone. Not with a storm, not with rage, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had given everything and finally realized they were no longer willing to disappear for it. The first thing he noticed was the silence, not the usual morning stillness before the office filled, not the early calm he used to relish. This was different, a hollow kind of silence, the kind that echoed. Mark Hensley arrived at 7:15 a.m., as he always had. Same elevator ride, same leather briefcase, same quiet nod to the front desk. But this morning, Claire's desk was empty, not just empty, cleared. No notebook, no teacup, no faint scent of bergamot. Just a chair pushed in, a wiped surface, and the absence of the person who had been there for 11 years. Mark stood in the doorway for longer than he realized. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared. He opened his office door. The lights were already on. That was strange. Claire always turned them on for him. He reached for the morning folder out of habit. There was none. No schedule. No prep notes. No briefing memo. Just a single envelope, centered on his desk, unsealed, no name, no decoration. He opened it with stiff fingers. Inside, another note. Claire's handwriting. Clean. Simple. "I packed quietly. You always preferred things that way. No anger, no plea, no drama, just finality." He sat down. The chair felt too soft, too still. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. The neat stacks of paper, the glass wall, the framed photo of his team on the wall behind him. Claire in the back row, slightly turned away from the camera. He hadn't noticed that before. He pressed the intercom to Evelyn's extension. "Evelyn." His voice cracked slightly. Is Claire officially gone?" There was a pause, then softly. "Yes. She submitted her resignation 3 days ago. HR processed it this morning." Mark closed his eyes. 3 days. And he hadn't even noticed. He didn't attend the staff meeting that morning, didn't answer emails, didn't take his calls. Instead, he sat in his office, staring at the door, waiting, as if maybe, just maybe, she'd walk in, one last time, with her usual steady presence, with her quiet nod, with her way of fixing what he didn't know was broken. But the door stayed shut. Midday. Evelyn knocked gently and stepped in. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him with that knowing, patient gaze of hers. "She left the file cabinet key with me," she said. "In case you need anything?" Mark nodded, She was always thinking ahead. He murmured. Evelyn gave a faint smile. She didn't want a farewell party, didn't want a goodbye lunch, said it would feel dishonest. Mark swallowed hard. Did she say anything else? Evelyn paused. She said if you ever asked, I could tell you this. She waited, longer than most people would have. Then she turned and left, closing the door softly behind her. Mark stood, suddenly restless. He paced, then walked out of his office and toward Claire's desk. He opened the top drawer. Empty. Second drawer. Empty. Third, just one thing. A plain envelope, labeled personal. He didn't open it. He held it in his hand, stared at it for a long time, then placed it back in the drawer and closed it carefully. He sat in her chair. The desk felt lower from this angle. The office looked different. And suddenly he saw it the world Claire had seen all these years. A man behind glass, always busy, always focused, rarely looking up. That evening, long after the building emptied, Mark stayed. He opened her notebooks left behind in the box Evelyn had given him. They were full of lists, meeting details, flight schedules, but also quotes, phrases, little pieces of her private thoughts, written in the margins. Some people live behind glass. You can see them, but you can't touch them. Silence is not always peace. Loyalty is not love. Mark sat at his desk and pulled a legal pad toward him. He hadn't handwritten anything in years. His fingers moved slowly, uncertainly. But eventually, they wrote, Claire, I saw more than I said. I felt more than I showed. I said less than I should have. I don't know if this letter will reach you, but I hope it does. He stared at the page, then folded it and left it on her desk. The lights of Boston twinkled below him, and for the first time in years, Mark realized he had built a life that looked full from the outside. But the only person who ever knew how hollow it could be was gone. The office no longer felt like his, not in the way it used to. Mark Hensley still arrived at 7:15, sharp, still wore the same rotation of dark suits, still carried the same briefcase. But without Claire, everything around him felt misaligned. The coffee arrived later now, and it was always a little too strong or too cold. His calendar had double bookings. Client names were spelled wrong in briefings, and no one reminded him that his mother's birthday was in 3 days. He hadn't remembered that on his own in 7 years. It wasn't that things were falling apart. They just weren't held together the way they used to be. And worse, everyone knew it. They didn't say it aloud, but he saw it in the glances. The way people hesitated when approaching his desk. The way Evelyn had quietly taken over scheduling, though she already had too much to do. But most of all, he felt it in the silence, the kind that follows something sacred being broken. One afternoon, Mark returned to the empty break room and saw Claire's favorite mug sitting near the sink. It had a tiny crack near the handle. He'd seen it before months ago, but never thought anything of it. She kept using it anyway. Never complained, never asked for a new one, just adapted. He rinsed it out slowly, then placed it back in the cupboard. It didn't belong to her anymore, but he couldn't throw it away. That evening, Mark stayed late again. His desk light was the only one still on, casting long shadows across the conference room wall. He opened Claire's last notebook, the smallest one, bound in soft black leather. She had left it without a note. Inside were handwritten lists of travel arrangements, reminders, and meeting times. But tucked at the back was something else. Not a list, not a quote, a letter, unfinished, no date, no recipient. I wonder if he ever knew. I wonder if he noticed the way I paused before knocking, the way I waited a little longer outside his door, hoping maybe he'd look up. I never wanted him to love me. I only wanted to be real to him. Not useful, not convenient, just real. Mark read the words 3 times. Then he leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and let the weight of them settle into his chest. He thought back to the first year she worked for him. She had once brought him coffee on a particularly rainy Tuesday. His tie had been soaked, his morning ruined by traffic, and his mood short. She had walked in quietly, placed the coffee down, and said, "I put a little cinnamon in. Hope that's okay." He'd barely acknowledged it, but he remembered the taste. It was comforting, unexpected, and he never said a word. Another memory surfaced. Claire bringing a birthday card for his father. She had bought it herself. Simple, classic design. She'd placed a sticky note on top that said, "You mentioned he likes jazz." Mark had mailed it, but never asked how she remembered that detail, never thanked her. Just another silent transaction in a long chain of small, quiet gifts. And now, each one of them echoed louder than words. He hadn't been cruel to her, but he hadn't seen her either, not fully. He had assumed her loyalty would remain, like furniture in a familiar room, useful, reliable, always there. But Claire had never been furniture. She had been the structure. Later that night, he sat in his car, parked outside the office. The windows fogged slightly as the autumn chill crept in. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a blank card, something he kept for clients. This one was cream-colored, no design, just space. He clicked his pen once, then paused. Finally, he wrote, "You mattered. Not because you were perfect, not because you were efficient, but because you were the only person who made this place feel human. I was too late in saying it, but I hope it's not too late for you to believe it." He didn't sign it, didn't even know where to send it, but he held the card for a long time, then placed it in his coat pocket and drove home. In the stillness of his apartment, Mark sat on the couch and let the weight of everything he hadn't said wash over him. And in that quiet, he made himself a promise. If he ever saw her again, he wouldn't stay silent. Not this time. Mark Hensley had never believed in letters. He believed in memos, in briefings, in numbers, in clean, bullet-pointed logic. Letters felt too emotional, too permanent, like carving your thoughts into something you couldn't undo. But lately, permanence didn't scare him. Silence did. That night, after the rest of Boston had fallen asleep under a blanket of fog, Mark sat at his kitchen table, a blank page in front of him. No laptop, no phone, just a pen. Just paper. The kind Claire used to leave notes on. He hesitated, then started to write. "Claire, I've spent my entire life building walls around things I didn't know how to feel. I've called it leadership, discipline, focus. But the truth is, it's fear. Fear of needing someone, of disappointing them, of not knowing how to say the right thing at the right time. You were never just efficient. You were never just the person who made my day easier. You were the voice that steadied me, The presence I didn't realize was anchoring me, and I didn't say thank you. Not the way I should have. Not the way you deserved. He paused, set the pen down. A breath, a sip of water, then continued. There were moments I saw you. When you laughed too quietly for anyone else to notice. When you stayed late but never complained. When you bought my father a birthday card and remembered the jazz detail I only mentioned once. And still, I didn't say anything. Maybe I thought it would make things complicated. Maybe I was afraid you'd expect something from me. I didn't know how to give. Or maybe I just never learned how to tell the truth without being asked. He stopped again, ran his hands through his hair, then folded the letter slowly, like it might shatter if he rushed. He didn't know where she was. She hadn't left an address, just absence. He set the folded letter aside and picked up a second piece of paper. This one was shorter, just 2 lines. There was a moment I thought you'd stay. Now I hope you find what you were waiting for all along. He stared at the 2 letters side by side, one full of confession, the other closure. He didn't know which one to send, or if he should send anything at all. The next day, Mark brought both letters to the office in a folder tucked inside his coat. He sat at his desk, hands hovering over the envelope like they might decide for him. Evelyn knocked softly. "I'm heading out early," she said. "It's my grandson's birthday." Mark looked up. "Of course. Go. Enjoy." She hesitated, then asked, "Have you heard from her?" He shook his head. Still thinking about writing, she asked gently. "I already did," he said. Evelyn studied him for a moment, then smiled softly. "Then maybe now it's not about whether you send it." Mark frowned slightly. "Then what is it about?" She tilted her head. "It's about whether you needed to write it for her. Or for yourself." And with that, she left. Later that evening, Mark found himself outside Claire's old apartment building. He had never been there before, but the address was still in the HR system, emergency contact only. He stood across the street for 10 minutes, watching, thinking. He didn't go in. He didn't knock. Instead, he left one envelope with the doorman, marked only for Claire Whitmore. If she ever stops by. He didn't say which letter it was. But as he walked away, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. Back at home, he opened his desk drawer and placed the second letter inside, unsent, unrushed, maybe unread, but not unspoken. For the first time in years, he slept without waking in the middle of the night. And in the quiet, there was no guilt, only the soft hum of something honest. Monday morning came gray and cold. Boston's skyline had softened under a light drizzle, the streets shimmering with reflections of wet brick and blinking traffic lights. Mark Hensley arrived at the office, umbrella in one hand, coat damp at the collar. The elevator chimed softly as it rose. He stepped out onto the executive floor, quiet, as usual. But as he walked toward his office, something made him stop. Claire's desk, still empty, still neat. A ghost of her stillness remained. But today, something was different. There was a cup on the desk, simple, white ceramic, steam rising, and the faint scent of bergamot. Mark blinked. He stepped closer. It was her tea. Her tea. And it was still warm. He looked around. The hallway was empty. The office doors closed. No one else would have known the brand, or the cup, or the precise way she brewed it just long enough for the scent to soften. Never too strong. He reached out and touched the cup lightly, still warm. She had been there. Not long ago. Maybe minutes. He stood still for a long time. Didn't move. Didn't speak. The tea was not a message, not a note, not a declaration, but it was something else. A presence, subtle, intentional, and just like her quiet, but undeniable. Mark walked into his office, closed the door behind him. He sat at his desk, exhaled slowly, and looked out the window. The sky was still gray, but the rain had stopped. He didn't know what the tea meant. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. Maybe it was just goodbye, done in her own way. Or maybe it was a beginning, not of what they had before, but of something truer, something that had no job title, no routine, no glass walls between them, just two people, and a cup of tea. That afternoon, Mark didn't cancel his meetings. He didn't disappear into silence. But between calls, he found himself glancing at that cup, not touching it, just watching the last wisps of warmth fade. And he wondered, had she taken the letter? Had she read it? Had she left the tea for him? Or for herself? Later that evening, Evelyn passed by his office. She noticed the cup. She smiled gently, then asked, "So, you saw it?" Mark nodded. "She was here," he said, not quite a question. Evelyn tilted her head. For a moment, Mark looked back at the tea, then said, almost to himself, "It's strange. I didn't realize how loud a cup of tea could be." Evelyn stepped back, gave him space, and Mark sat quietly, not in grief, not in regret, but in something new. Acceptance, and a hope so fragile, he dared not name it. A week passed. The teacup remained on Claire's desk, untouched but never cleared. Mark had made no move to remove it. No one did. It became a quiet fixture like her once was. Some days, he thought of writing again. Other days, he just worked. But he worked differently now. He paused more often. He asked Evelyn how her mother was doing. He sat in meetings without checking his watch. He remembered the intern's name. He noticed the sadness in people's faces, not to fix it, just to see it. The office began to change too, not in policies or slogans, but in presence. One afternoon, Grace, the front desk assistant, said to him gently, "You hold eye contact now, sir. You didn't used to." Mark nodded. No defense offered. Friday came with the sharp wind of late spring. Mark stood at the glass wall of his office, watching Boston move. Below, life kept rushing horns, footsteps, umbrellas opening like petals. He turned back toward his desk and stopped. There, beside the teacup, was an envelope. No one had seen who left it. No one had buzzed. No name. Just the familiar script. It said, simply, "If you're still trying, meet me Sunday, 4 p.m., Magnolias." His breath caught. He sat down slowly, and for a long time, he didn't move. Then, finally, he allowed himself something rare. A smile. Not wide, but honest. Sunday, 4:01 p.m., Magnolia's Cafe, Cambridge. The place was quiet. A small family-owned bakery tucked near the Charles River. Mark stood outside for a few seconds before pushing the door open. Warmth met him. The scent of cinnamon, fresh bread, and chamomile. He looked around. And there she was. Claire, sitting by the window, hair loosely pinned up, a sweater the color of morning fog draped across her shoulders, a book open, a second cup already on the table. He approached. She looked up. No surprise, no guardedness, just calm. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she replied. He sat. No preamble, no apology, just a breath shared between them. They didn't speak for the first few minutes. It wasn't awkward, just honest. "Finally," Claire said, "I read your letter." Mark nodded. "I figured." She looked at him then. "You meant it, all of it," he replied. She stirred her tea, then asked, "So what now?" He smiled faintly. "I don't know. That's the first real answer I've had in years." Claire chuckled. It was soft, rare, familiar. Then she said, "Good." And they sipped their tea in silence again. But this time, it wasn't absence. It was presence. He didn't ask her to come back to the company. She didn't offer. That wasn't the point. They talked about books, weather, Claire's brother Miguel, how he loved puzzles now, Mark's late father, a dog they saw chasing pigeons outside the cafe. They spoke like people, not roles. And toward the end, Claire said something that stayed with him long after. "You were never cold." "Mark, just scared." He looked at her. "I still am." She nodded. "That's okay. Just don't be silent." That night, Mark didn't write a new letter. He didn't need to. But he did something else. He printed out Claire's resignation email, and beneath it, in his handwriting, he wrote, "Thank you for teaching me to see." He framed it, not to hang, just to keep, to remember. 3 months later, a new role opened at Hensley & Co., Director of Culture and People Development, a position Claire would have been perfect for. He didn't send her the job listing, but one day a resume appeared in the HR inbox. No cover letter, just a note. Sometimes it takes distance to see clearly. I see it now. See. Mark didn't call her. He just clicked accept for interview. She didn't return as a secretary. She returned as an equal. And their conversations, still brief sometimes, still quiet, but always real. He thanked her more often, asked about her day. She never brought his coffee again. He made it himself, and sometimes left a second cup on her desk, just in case. And once, in the middle of a chaotic Monday, Claire walked past his door, paused, and said, still trying. Mark looked up, smiled. Every day, in life, we often think showing up, working hard, and staying strong is enough. Especially as we get older, we rely on routines and achievements to define us. But sometimes, we forget the quiet people who stand beside us not with grand gestures, but with steady presence. This story reminds us success means nothing if you don't truly see the people who help you build it. Elena didn't leave because she wanted more money or a bigger title. She left because she was no longer seen. And Mark, like so many of us, only realized what he had when it was gone. So today, take a moment, look around you. Who's quietly keeping your world steady? Who deserves a thank you? You've never said, it's never too late to notice, to speak, to show up not with power, but with presence. Because in the end, people don't remember what we built. They remember how we made them feel. See someone today and let them know they matter. Thank you for spending your precious time with us. If this story touched your heart, made you reflect, or reminded you of someone important, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support means more than you know. It helps us continue bringing you heartfelt stories that matter. See you in the next one. Until then, stay kind, stay present,